Thank you, John, for that very nice introduction that I now have to live up to. So I want to talk about my book, Prohibition, Gangsters, The Rise and Fall of a Bad Generation. And this book, it's not an encyclopedia. There are a lot of books out there about Prohibition gangsters that are entries in alphabetical order of the gangsters from that era. But that's not what I tried to do. I wanted to write a collective biography of a generation. And the book begins with the teenaged Al Capone waiting on tables in Brooklyn in 1917 and moves up to the death of the last of the generation, a guy named Giuseppe Bonanno, also known as Joe Bananas, who died in 2002, the last of that generation. In the book, I take a look not just at the gangsters, but larger issues in American society that affected them, like immigration and the Great Depression, and changing morality and politics and law enforcement. There's a lot about New Jersey in here, and I know I've written a lot of books about New Jersey, but I tried to make this a national book. So let me begin with January 17th, 1920. On that day, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect, banning, quote, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors in the United States. In effect, what was happening with Prohibition is that the federal government took a major American industry, the liquor industry, and gave it as a gift to gangsters. That's what it amounted to. It was an opportunity unlike anything that previous generations of criminals had known. An opportunity whereby a man who might today be described as an underachiever, a bully, a dropout, a social misfit, could achieve status and wealth. Well, what did these men have in common? Most were Jews and Italians. This was a period when immigration from the rural villages of Italy and the agricultural shtetls of Poland and Russia was at its height. The gangsters who came from this generation were mostly brought to America as children or were born in America to newly arrived immigrants. And most of them were born in the 25-year span from 1880 to 1905, which means that when Prohibition went into effect, most of them were in their 20s. As still happens with immigrants, the most recent groups to arrive get stuck in the lowest paying jobs in the rundown part of town. The fathers of the Prohibition generation toiled and worked like ditch diggers and railroad track layers and shoemakers and barbers and garment workers. For their sons, access into the professional white-collar kind of jobs was blocked, but crime could provide a route out of the ghetto. These sons were looking for status. They favored tailored suits with cuffed pants and silk ties and fedora hats. Guns, which brought a sense of power, were part of the criminal culture too. I always carried a gun, said one mobster, recalling how it was in the Prohibition era. It was just like wearing an overcoat. The image that the gangsters cultivated was to be larger than life, more powerful, more respected, more feared. Nobody could confuse those Prohibition mobsters with the manual laborers their immigrant fathers had been. Well, what did they accomplish? Before Prohibition, organized crime in America was a small stakes affair that primarily involved hurting people or threatening to hurt people in one way or another through blackmail, shakedowns, loan sharking, extortion, robbery, and just general thuggery. The accomplishment of the Prohibition generation was to expand the level and sophistication of crime in the nation. And what they also achieved was being admired. They were seen in many ways like Robin Hoods. They were providing what the public wanted, and there was a certain romantic fascination with gangsters that ended with the Great Depression. Now, in my book, I trace the story of the Prohibition gangsters in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland, Kansas City, Philadelphia, Atlantic City. But the big story was New York. That's where most of it was happening. New York City in the 1920s is kind of an iconic place in American memory. It was 6 million people. It was the largest city in the nation. Chorus girls danced at the Ziegfeld Follies. Nightclub hostess Texas Guinan greeted tipsy partiers with a cheery, "Hello, suckers." Babe Ruth smacked out home runs at Yankee Stadium. Charles Lindbergh and Queen Marie of Romania got ticker tape parades down Wall Street. Langston Hughes wrote poetry in Harlem. Barbers exchanged Wall Street tips with their customers. Street corner newsboys in cloth caps really shouted, "Extra, extra, read all about it." Duke Ellington and his band belted out jazz at the Cotton Club. Ocean liners steamed into New York Harbor with immigrants in steerage and the rich in first class. And crime, too, was part of the New York landscape in the 1920s. So let's take a look at some of the New York gangsters who got their start in the Prohibition era. There are plenty to choose from. For example, Legs Diamond. You've probably heard of Legs Diamond. Well, for a while during Prohibition, Legs ran a nightclub called the Hotsy Totsy Club in Midtown Manhattan. Well, one night, 3 drunks came into the Hotsy Totsy Club and started banging on the bar and harassing the waiters. And Legs Diamond went up to them and said, "I'm Legs Diamond and I run the place. If you don't calm down, I'm going to blow your head off." To which one of the drunks said, "You no good bastard, you can't push me around." Well, Diamond pulled out his gun and started shooting, and the band at the nightclub played a little louder to cover the sound of the gunshots. And in the end, 2 of the drunks were dead and 1 other wounded. And I think this may be the worst ever example of customer service. Then there was Ciro Terranova. He was known as the Artichoke King. And why the Artichoke King? Because that was his racket. And from all the the artichokes were brought into New York City, he got a cut. So what was the big deal with artichokes? Well, artichokes were a key ingredient in a minestrone soup. So Italians had to buy some artichokes. And it was also in Italian culture, artichokes were considered to be an aphrodisiac. And a matter of fact, Ciro Terranova had 10 kids, so maybe it worked. There was Louis Lepke or Louis Buchalter. He was the master of a huge labor union empire. He made headlines when he decided to surrender to J. Edgar Hoover in person and the celebrity reporter Walter Winchell. Lepke thought that by voluntarily surrendering, the law would give him a break. Well, the law did not give him a break, and he became the only major gangster to die in the electric chair. There was Abe Kid Twist Rellis. He was a member of Murder Incorporated who turned stool pigeon. And while he was in police custody in Brooklyn, he fell to his death from the 6th floor of a hotel window, probably because he knew too much. He is known ever since as the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Then there was Albert Anastasia. He was brutally assassinated while getting a haircut in a Manhattan barbershop. And so the police were there, and reporters came to the barbershop where the killing happened. And the reporter asked the chief of detectives. He said, "Why do you think they shot him?" And the chief of detectives said, "Maybe somebody didn't like him." But let me talk at length about 2 New York mobsters who were famous in their day. One is a Jew and one is an Italian. I'll be looking at the careers of these 2 men and the nature of organized crime by describing the headline-grabbing courtroom trials that brought them down. I think that the record of courtroom trials, the transcripts, are valuable because they reveal the truth to some extent of what Prohibition gangsters were up to. So, the first one I want to talk about is Waxy Gordon. Now, Waxy Gordon's real name was Irving Wexler. He was born on January 19, 1888, to an immigrant Polish-Jewish family on New York's Lower East Side. Gordon started out at the bottom of the criminal ladder, probably the lowest you could be, which was a lowly pickpocket. And he also worked as what was called being a labor slammer, a thug employed by labor unions to intimidate management or hired by management to beat up strikers. He carried a gun. In 1913, he was a suspect in the murder of a rival outside a dance hall. He had a long rap sheet with arrests not only for picking pockets, but also for parole violation, assault, and robbery. The police records described him as a gruff, powerful, thick-set man. Now, about the origin of his nickname, Waxy Gordon. So some people think it was because he was a pickpocket and he could remove a wallet as if it were wax. I don't think that's the case. I think his real name was Wexler, and I think running around with kids, it got changed to Waxy. Waxy might have stayed at the lowest levels of what we call disorganized crime, but in 1920, when he was in his early 30s, along came the unique, extraordinary opportunity of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Waxy got involved in one of the early cross-Atlantic liquor smuggling operations with Arnold Rothstein, who perhaps you've heard of. And if you watch that show, Boardwalk Empire, they portray Arnold Rothstein pretty well. He was a gambler. He was known as the Big Bankroll, so-called because he provided money for underworld projects. The most famous of his underworld investments was fixing the 1919 World Series. Became known as the so-called Black Sox scandal. Well, as it turned out, Waxy's involvement in rum running with Arnold Rothstein was successful and started the one-time pickpocket on the path to becoming a major New York bootlegger who branched out into lucrative investments in real estate. He owned 2 New York hotels. He had an appreciation for the high life. He lived with his wife and 2 children in a luxury 10-room apartment on Central Park West in New York. He had expensive cars. He had a library of classic books. He paid to have his kids be given horseback riding lessons in Central Park. He owned a posh summer home in Bradley Beach, New Jersey. One of Waxy's hobbies was investing in Broadway shows. One of them was the musical Strike Me Pink, starring Jimmy Durante. And the female lead was Lupe Velez, whose nickname was the Mexican Spitfire. I just talk about her because I love that nickname, the Mexican Spitfire. And Gordon was often said to enjoy the company of attractive chorus girls. A story survives that while watching the rehearsal of a new production, he spotted an attractive young woman in the chorus line. "Whose gal is that?" he asked the director. "She ain't nobody's girl," the director replied, to which Waxy said, "If she ain't nobody's girl, how in hell she get in the show?" Which tells you about what Broadway was like in those days. And in 1929, he saw an opportunity for making money by taking over New Jersey breweries. Some breweries in New Jersey, they were owned by an Irish gang that included James Culhane, James Bugs Donovan, Fred Dunn, and Fred Werther. Now, evidently, these Irishmen did not want to sell out to Waxy Gordon. And within a span of about 6 months, Donovan and Dunn were shot to death, Werther was wounded, and Culhane departed the state. And Waxy now had the New Jersey brewery empire he desired. The one brewery most often mentioned in the legal record was the Eureka Cereal Beverage Company in Paterson. Now, the headquarters of Waxy's New Jersey beer empire was a 6-room suite on the 8th floor of the ritzy Elizabeth Carteret Hotel. Gordon was in the hotel on April 12, 1933. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, some person or persons unknown shot 2 of his partners, Max Greenberg and Max Hassel. They were shot to death. Waxy, who claimed he was in another part of the hotel at the time, was able to escape. After the shooting at the hotel, Waxy Gordon dropped out of sight. On a tip, agents from the Special Investigative Unit of the United States Treasury Department and from the New York State Police raided a house on the White Lake in the Catskill region of New York. Neighbors had been suspicious about the house because the occupants of the house only seemed to come out at night. The raid took place a month and 9 days after the hotel murders. The investigators found that the house was occupied by Waxy Gordon, along with members of his gang. Waxy insisted there had been a mistake, that his name was actually William Polinsky, but an alert Treasury agent noticed that the suspect wore silk underwear with the initials I.W. on them, Irving Wexler. Now, you may be wondering, why was the United States Treasury agent looking at Waxy Gordon's underwear? It was because, for some time, Waxy Gordon was being investigated for income tax evasion. Now, let me explain something about income tax evasion. It was really difficult to convict these gangsters of crimes like murder because the criminals bribed local police and judges. They used the threat of violence against witnesses. But in 1927, the United States Supreme Court ruled that criminals had to pay taxes on their income, even if they got the money illegally, and failure to do so was a federal offense. So cases under this income tax evasion law, they were tried not at the local level, where it was easy to bribe the judges and the attorneys and so on, but they were tried at the federal level by United States government prosecutors. And what the federal government prosecutors had to prove was that they, A, had earned money, and B, had failed to pay taxes on the money. It was a prosecutorial tool that made it easier to bring gangsters to justice. So the first major crime lord to be sent to prison for income tax evasion was Al Capone. And the government then decided on Waxy Gordon as its second big target for an income tax evasion investigation. This brings us to Thomas E. Dewey. He was the chief assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was assigned to prosecute Waxy Gordon. And what a confrontation that was. On one side was the WASP Dewey, a Midwest Episcopalian Republican. He had an outstanding attendance record at the Owasso, Michigan Public Schools. He graduated with honors from the University of Michigan. He got his law degree from Columbia. He also studied to be a classical music singer, and he developed a deep baritone voice that enabled him to reach every corner of the courtroom. This was a valuable asset because in those days there were no microphones in these courtrooms. In fact, these courtrooms are pretty dim, bad lighting and bad acoustics and everything. But because he could sing, he was able to reach every corner of the courtroom. In contrast, his opponent, Waxy Gordon, got his education on the streets of the Lower East Side, where most kids dropped out before high school. Far from being a trained singer with excellent elocution, he spoke with a dees, dem, and does accent from the Lower East Side. Well, when he took on Waxy Gordon, Dewey was a young man of 28, but he was absolutely thoroughly determined. While Waxy was establishing his beer empire in New Jersey, Dewey's investigators tapped his phone, looked through his legal and financial records to assemble an incriminating paper trail. In all, some 1,000 potential witnesses were interviewed. The case was the United States of America versus Irving Wexler. It opened on November 20th, 1933 in a Manhattan federal court. It lasted for 7 days. They're in session for 10 hours a day. During this time, Dewey brought forth 131 witnesses to prove to the jury that Gordon had earned $2 million in the years 1930 and 31, but had paid less than $3,000 in taxes on that money. So the trial began with Dewey giving his opening statement to the jury. He said that the defense lawyers in the courtroom would argue on behalf of their client, Irving Wexler. But Dewey said, "My client is the 120 million people who look to you to protect them, to protect their homes, their lives, their property, their sense of justice." And he went on to explain, "This is not a beer case. It is not a murder case. It is not a case of any kind except an income tax case," said Dewey. He prepared the jury by warning them that the defense would try to blame dead men, said Dewey. "In fact, almost everybody who does not want to tell the truth in this case will point to a dead man and say he owned the business, or he knows all about it, or he is the responsible party. I don't know anything. I have no interest. I am just an innocent lamb," said Dewey. And so one by one, the prosecution's witnesses took the stand. Now, one of the most interesting people, witnesses in the case, was a woman. Helen Dembeck was her name. She was a young Polish woman who owned a restaurant named Helen's Lunchroom near a garage that was part of Waxy Gordon's properties in Paterson. On the stand, she described how Waxy's men had made telephone calls from her restaurant from which she had to pay the bills. And she said, "When they started use my phone, I didn't say anything about bills. Only I always call up operator and ask her how much bill was. So Waxy Gordon say, when bill comes, just let my man, give it to him so we take care of bills. So I always gave him and they paid it." So Dewey cited this as proof that Waxy Gordon was in charge of that brewery. Another part of the outspoken Helen Dembeck's testimony concerned Bugs Donovan, the previous owner of the brewery, and on several occasions she would talk on the witness stand about the time before Bugs Donovan was murdered. Now, Waxy's attorney vehemently protested that kind of language, and the judge said to the witness, "You must not say before Donovan was murdered. Just say he didn't come around anymore." And Helen innocently asked, "How could he come around, Your Honor? He was murdered." So the judge offered to strike these words from the record, but the weary defense counsel said, "Apparently he's dead, so what's the use?" Now, another important witness in the case was Oscar Brockert, who was hired by the Eureka Brewery as the brewmaster. He said that he had seen Waxy Gordon in the brewery acting every bit like the owner of the operation. The brewmaster also gave lengthy testimony about how things operated and the enormous profits that came from bootlegging. In a good week, they could produce 7,000 barrels of bootleg beer. Under questioning by Dewey, Brockert told how you should really make good beer. He said it should stay for 8 to 12 weeks in fermentation vats. But the beer produced in Waxy's brewery was not good beer. It was kept in the vat for only 48 hours. And how did Brockert and the other workers get the beer out of the plant and into barrels? In the brewery, there was a pipe that pumped out the beer to a house across the street to the brewery, where it was then pumped into hoses like canvas fireman hoses that ran through the sewer system of Patterson. So it ran to a garage where it was poured into barrels. And the garage was right across the street from Helen Dembeck's lunchroom, which explains why she found that the workers at the garage always smelled like beer. So if you like high-quality beer, made in sanitary conditions and the finest ingredients, this bootleg stuff would not be your cup of tea. But you have to acknowledge the ingenuity of those Prohibition gangsters. And I want to just say something about bootlegging and beer. So under Prohibition, you could make near beer, which was 0.05% alcohol. But to make near beer, you had to make real beer. And then you had to reduce the alcohol in the real beer and sell it as near beer. But nobody wanted near beer. What they wanted was real beer. And Brockert estimated that 98% of the production at the factory, at the brewery, was real beer. And 2% was near beer, again, which nobody cared about. Well, after the prosecution phase of the trial, defense lawyer Charles F.G. Whale sought to convince the jury that Waxy was not a multimillionaire tax dodger, did not own breweries, had only modest real estate holdings. He depicted Gordon as a loving husband and father, whose ambition was to provide for his wife and children. And when he took the stand for the defense, Waxy admitted he had been a bootlegger, but claimed that he was essentially an employer of the deceased Max Greenberg and Max Hassel in the brewery and in real estate business. He was just a junior partner, he said. Then came Thomas Dewey's turn to examine the defendant. Dewey was relentless. He drilled down to the smallest details to put Waxy through the ringer. Here's an excerpt from Dewey's dominating cross-examination. So you have to imagine the prosecutor's booming voice and the slurred Lower East Side diction of the defendant. So Dewey said, "Did you or did you not have insurance on your household furniture for $100,000 in the year 1931? Yeah, I did. Well, how did you acquire $100,000 worth of furniture with an income of $6,000 a year? Well, there was no $100,000 worth of furniture. That included everything. What did it include? Well, it included clothes, rugs, children's books, everything to place books. How did you acquire $100,000 worth of property on an income of $6,000 a year?" And that went on and on and on with Dewey beating away at Waxy Gordon. Well, the extent of Dewey's ability to build a successful case was demonstrated by the fact that it took the jury a mere 51 minutes to find Waxy Gordon guilty. The bootlegger was sent to 10 years in federal prison, and he had to pay $20,000 in fine and $60,000 in court costs. A New York Times reporter described the scene in the courtroom when the jury rendered its guilty verdict. Gordon's jaws sagged, and his dark eyes fixed in hatred on the men in the jury box as their verdict was pronounced. The judge directed Gordon to rise to hear the sentence. Behind him, a woman sobbed. It was Mrs. Leah Wexler, his wife. Her eyes and her face were red. She stifled the sound that came to her lips. She pressed her handkerchief against them. Well, after the trial, Mr. and Mrs. Wexler had more to sorrow over. Their only son, Teddy, a pre-med student at the University of North Carolina, was driving north to New York to be with his parents at this difficult time. But when he was in Pennsylvania, the car he was driving in veered off the road in a fog, and Teddy was killed. So Waxy Gordon had to plead with Dewey to allow him to go to his son's funeral, which Dewey allowed, but stipulated that Waxy would have to be guarded at all times. So Waxy read the Jewish prayers for the dead, knowing that soon after he would be behind bars in a federal prison. Well, the story about Waxy Gordon does not end there. Because of good behavior in federal prison, he was released after serving 7 years, 7 years of his 10-year sentence. Back in New York, he was interviewed by reporters. He told them he was going to be a salesman. Waxy Gordon is dead. That's all over. It's Wexler I'm interested in. But before long, he was back in the business of crime, violating the World War II rationing laws. For this, he was sentenced to a year in prison. After that, he took up dealing narcotics. In August 1951 came the end of the line. He was arrested on a New York street corner for selling heroin. Now, this was not a nickel bag affair, you know, some low-class smuggling. It was a major deal to sell 2 pounds of heroin for $9,000. And it was actually a sting operation worked out by the Federal Narcotics Bureau and the New York police to bust a major narcotics smuggling operation. The 63-year-old Waxy pleaded with the arresting officer, Detective Sergeant John Catone of the New York Narcotics Squad. Said Waxy Gordon, "Please kill me, John, shoot me. I'm an old man, I'm through. Don't take me in for junk. How else can I live? Let me run, John, and then you shoot me." Well, he was not shot by the policeman. He instead was sentenced to a term of 25 years to life. And on June 24, 1952, Waxy Gordon was in Alcatraz prison when he died from a massive heart attack. So ends the saga of Waxy Gordon, a child of the Lower East Side who started at the bottom of the criminal food chain. He rose to the top as a master of a New Jersey bootlegging empire, only to fall back down to the bottom. Now, as I said, I want to talk about an Italian New York gangster from that era. He was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897. He immigrated with his parents to the Lower East Side in 1907. He followed the customary path of dropping out of school, committing street crime, going through reform school and prison, becoming a member of one of the youthful gangs that predated Prohibition. He took on a new name. Does anybody know Salvatore Lucania, what name he took? Oh, you folks are good. That's right. They say he didn't like Salvatore because it could be made into Sally. He thought that was too feminine. So Lucky Luciano or Charlie Lucky.
What's his new name?
Pardon?
Lucky Luciano.
Lucky Luciano, a.k.a. Charlie Lucky. The fact that he had Sicilian ancestry helped his rise in the mafia. One Neapolitan mobster observed, "If you hang out with a Sicilian for 20 years and you have trouble with another Sicilian, the Sicilian that you hung out with all that time will turn on you." So, but Lucky Luciano was a Sicilian, so it had helped him in the mafia. He was a man of medium stature, and despite pockmarked skin, perhaps from scarlet fever, he had dark, good looks. He learned to dress conservatively and mix easily with people born to a higher rank in society. But he still spoke with the slang of the Lower East Side and a little bit of Sicilian. A mobster from that era, another mobster, said he possessed shrewd intelligence and level-mindedness that made him a good leader and a superb organizer. With his Jewish and Italian colleagues, Luciano built a mob in the 1920s that engaged in bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, and brothels. Now, so his gang was not just Italian or Sicilian. He had a number of Jewish friends like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. And there's an anecdote that one of his gang members, Vito Genovese, complained about the Jews that Lucky Luciano brought into the organization. And according to this tradition, Vito Genovese said, "What are you trying to do, load us up with a bunch of Hebes?" To which one of Luciano's henchmen said, "Take it easy, Don Vitone, you're nothing but a freaking foreigner yourself." And I like that line. May not be true, may be true, but it's nice to think that Lucky Luciano fostered diversity. Well, no, I'm serious about that. He did, you know, and okay. But now let us jump ahead into the early 1930s, skipping over the rivalry between the two top mafia bosses in New York, Giuseppe Masseria, who called himself the boss, and Salvatore Maranzano, who regarded himself as the capi di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. So both the boss and the boss of all bosses, stood in the way of Luciano's rise to the top. Within 5 months in 1931, they were both assassinated, and Luciano emerged as the top mafia boss in the city. Did Luciano have something to do with the deaths of Masseria and Maranzano? I think you could bet that he did. But sometimes it's not so good to be at the top, because it can attract unwanted attention. Which brings us back to the ever-ambitious Tom Dewey, who is now the special prosecutor of New York, appointed by the governor of the state. And if you're a special prosecutor, you really need to find somebody special to prosecute. And what better candidate than Lucky Luciano? But Dewey could not use the tool of income tax evasion because Luciano was smart enough to pay all the income tax he owed. So Dewey came up with another crime to get Luciano on, running the prostitution racket in New York, or more technically, the charge was that he was responsible for violating the law against forcing women into prostitution. And as you can imagine, prostitution was a grim, horrible business. It was estimated at the time that there were 2,000 prostitutes who worked at 300 brothels in New York City. The women worked from 10 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And all of this took place in the sleazy world where bail bondsmen, lawyers, magistrates, police court clerks were on the take. And at the top was a small group of mobsters who made most of the money. Now, nobody ever accused Thomas E. Dewey of half measures. From his headquarters in the Woolworth skyscraper, he arranged for police raids that rounded up the top mobsters in the racket, as well as roughly 100 prostitutes and madams. Dewey's staff members interviewed all those in custody, and from those interrogations, Dewey assembled enough evidence to have a warrant issued for the arrest of Lucky Luciano. At that point, Luciano, we knew he was being investigated. He had gone on the lam in Hot Springs, Arkansas, a spa much used by gangsters. And he was brought back in handcuffs to New York City, and his bail was set at an unreachable $350,000. Well, the trial of Luciano and his co-defendants began on May 11th, 1936. Dewey explained to the jury that Luciano could be found guilty of forcing women into prostitution even if he did not do it himself but had ordered underlings to do so. The most important prosecution witnesses in this trial were 2 prostitutes. One was Cokie Flo, and the Cokie came from her cocaine addiction, and the other was Nancy Presser. Now, they both testified that they knew Luciano, and they heard him describe the racket in a way that indicated he was in charge. Cokie Flo, for example, testified on the witness stand that she heard Luciano talk of franchising brothels in New York, and he said it was something like A&P grocery stores. A&P grocery store. It was a franchise. Nancy Presser said that she heard Luciano tell his underlings to wreck the joint, meaning to break apart a bordello owned by somebody who was not obeying the mob. And incidentally, if you're interested in this, I think you should see the 1937 movie Marked Woman, starring Bette Davis as a hooker who testified, and Humphrey Bogart as the Dewey-like prosecutor. It's a good movie. Well, and incidentally, everybody knew everybody. Nancy Presser knew Waxy Gordon, and Lucky Luciano knew Waxy Gordon. So there was interconnections between these mobsters. Well, the defense attorneys did everything they could to discredit Cokie Flo and Nancy Presser and other disreputable witnesses brought into court by Dewey. But Dewey had already inoculated the jury by telling them in his opening presentation that the prosecution's case would have to rely on the testimony, he said, of, quote, prostitutes, madams, eels, pimps, and ex-convicts. He observed, we can't get bishops to testify. Well, when it was the defense's turn to present its case, their witnesses were also non-bishops, including the Dark Lord himself, Lucky Luciano. In his 4-hour cross-examination of the gangster, Dewey launched into the same persistent grilling he had applied to Waxy Gordon. Luciano denied any connection to prostitution, but Dewey dredged up every other suspicious crime or episode that the mob boss had been involved in, including smuggling narcotics, a delay at one point in paying his back taxes. Here is one exchange where Dewey is cross-examining Luciano. On July 19, 1926, were you with a man named Joe Scalise, and did you have 2 revolvers and shotguns with 45 rounds of ammunition in your car? And Luciano said, yeah, we was hunting. And what were you hunting? Peasants. And Tom Dewey said, you mean pheasants? And Luciano said, yeah, that's right. So Dewey, but he pounced on everything. He said, you mean to tell me that you were shooting pheasants out of season? So he was relentless. And that was about the only laugh in the whole trial. At the end of the 4-week trial, the jury spent the night of June 7th deliberating, and at 6 a.m. the next morning, they returned guilty verdicts for 9 defendants, including Luciano. Lucky was ultimately sentenced to a term of 30 to 50 years in prison. This conviction was a tremendous victory for Thomas E. Dewey, and his reputation as a gangbuster helped him win election the following year as Manhattan District Attorney. 5 years later, he was elected as governor of New York, a post he held 3 times, and he subsequently ran for the presidency of the United States. Now, some crime writers have since criticized Dewey for inflating the importance of Lucky Luciano. The theory is that Charlie Lucky was just another run-of-the-mill mafia hoodlum, but that it would help Dewey's career to depict Lucky as a mastermind who dominated the New York underworld. Well, my opinion is that Luciano was, in fact, a top dog. At Luciano's trial, a hood described the meeting that took place at a Manhattan restaurant, and the witness said, you know, it was funny. We were sitting down, and when Charlie Lucky came in, all the Italians stood up. So I think that's pretty good evidence that Luciano was a top character in the New York crime scene. So Lucky Luciano languished in the New York prison system, but a decade after the trial came a remarkable twist. Tom Dewey, now the governor of New York, came before the New York State Legislature and said that he was reducing Luciano's sentence. The mobster was released from prison and deported by ship to his birthplace, Italy. As justification, Dewey said he was taking this step because while he was in jail, Luciano had helped the United States military in World War II. The story was that from his prison cell, Luciano had sent out word to dock workers that they should prevent enemy sabotage, keep tabs on the Italian-American fishing fleet, and to be on the lookout for U-boats. And when the Allies landed in Sicily and Italy later in the war, Luciano, it was said, sent out word to mafia leaders in the old country to help the invading Americans. And there's been a big controversy about this. Was this true? And since Dewey was involved in politics, there was a political angle, and Dewey's enemies charged that he was being bribed by Luciano to save that. And so there was a lot written about it, and I've read some of that, and I think there's some element of truth to that, based on the testimony of U.S. Navy intelligence officers who said he had provided some help to them. Luciano's time in Italy was mostly okay. He would occasionally get harassed by Italian authorities, and by the terms of his deportation, he was forbidden from visiting the United States. He died of a heart attack in Naples in 1962. At the request of his family, his body was shipped back to the United States and is buried in St. John's Cemetery in New York City. And I think that's a reminder that the story of Lucky Luciano and so many others of his generation, for better or worse, is an American story that deserves to be told. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have some time for question and answers, and we have a young lady there with a microphone. So somebody have a question? John, you do?
Yeah.
Okay. Wait for the microphone.
I realize I should have introduced you as Mark Ten Fingers Mappin. I'm sorry. I'm struck by the idea of an articulate prosecutor who becomes governor and then runs for president. And I wonder if you see parallels beyond that between Tom Dewey and the current governor of New Jersey.
You mean a tough prosecutor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes his name
No,
that way?
can't think of anybody.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question back there?
Okay, you mentioned that the gangsters had control of some breweries.
Yes.
Were any of them legitimate breweries? Like some of the old-time Krugers, Tromers, and things like that?
So the question is, were these breweries extensions of the business that had been there, right? Yeah. Well, they needed breweries. They had to buy, these gangsters, they had to buy breweries. And so they did acquire some breweries that had been in operation, you know. Which brings us back to near beer, because it was allowable to have a brewery as long as you were producing near beer, 0.05%, which of course they weren't. So in these breweries, to make sure that the beer that was producing was a near beer, federal agents from the Prohibition Bureau were stationed there, and they must have known what was going on, and they must have been paid off. But they signed reports showing that it was the near beer that was being produced. So there were still breweries in operation, but they were producing real beer illegally and then a few drops of near beer legally. Woman back there.
I'm Eileen, and I'm Douglas graduate, proud to say.
Uh-huh.
My question has to do with the jury selection. I was wondering how difficult was it in these kinds of trials to find jurors who were willing to serve, and was there any influence that went on behind the scenes?
You bet. There was influence behind the scenes. And one problem was with witnesses. You know, there would be witnesses to a crime, and then they would get this element that was known as Chicago amnesia, where they would not remember what had happened, and they said they couldn't testify. You know, and obviously they were being pressured by the gangsters, either by threats that will kill you if you testify, will kill your family, or by being offered money. Both seemed to work. And the jurors, yeah, the jurors were subject to the same thing. The criminals like Longy Zwillman of Newark, New Jersey's own gangsters, he was arrested for jury tampering, meaning that he paid off the jury to come to a not guilty verdict. So yes, intimidating witnesses was common, and that's why the witness protection program, that current things that'll take witnesses who testify and it'll protect them so that they would give testimony in trials. That's been a big help in fighting crime. Yeah, here's a question.
I'm Stuart Friedman, and had the pleasure of growing up in Fort Lee, which was the bedroom of some of the people in the world.
Yeah.
But I wondered whether your research went beyond the alcohol business, and did you look at any of the industries like newspaper and magazine distribution?
No, I didn't look into that, but I did look into rackets, you know, which was a name given to some kind of activity that made you a living. And so I mentioned Ciro Terranova, whose racket was selling artichokes. And labor racketeering was very big. And yeah, fake unions, corrupt unions like the moving picture ushers union and things like that. And trying to think of some of the other unions. Well, it was a good old extortion that worked very well for them. And there was gambling, and there was prostitution, and there was still loan sharking. And there was plenty of opportunity, and these guys did it. And then when Prohibition ended in 1933, a lot of them went into legitimate business, like the liquor business. Meyer Lansky became an executive with a liquor firm. And then he became a salesman of jukeboxes for bars and things like that. And then a lot of them went into legitimate businesses. So they would have a legitimate business, like Lucky Luciano, or rather Longy Zwillman, who had a truck leasing business that was legitimate. But then he got sweetheart deals with the city of Newark, and they would pay a high price for the vehicles he was renting. So there was all kinds of opportunity for making money. Up here, this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Joel Kirsch. Joe Kennedy was supposedly involved in Prohibition. Was there any relationship with Kennedy and the gangsters?
Well, that's a big topic, and there's been a lot of debate about that. And some people say that's a rumor because he was, you know, Joe Kennedy, and others say that he had nothing to do with it. Yeah, that. And the latest biography of Joe Kennedy says that these allegations are false, or at least unproven. So that's probably one of these things we'll never know. That gentleman there?
During that period, did you ever hear of a place called Derby Dad's?
No, where was that located?
Oh, Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh, okay. Well, Pittsburgh is not in my book, but I got Detroit, and I got Kansas City, Missouri, and a lot of places. They all had their equivalent.
That was his father's place.
Oh, yeah? For the sequel, I'll put that in.
understand that pharmacies were able to dispense alcohol at that time. Was there a connection?
Yes, there were a lot of loopholes in the Volstead Act. One of which is that a doctor could prescribe in a prescription, could prescribe alcohol. So there were a whole bunch of doctors who did that routinely to make money. And
Making it.
yeah, they were making it. And then there was sacramental wine. So that was exempt from the prohibition laws. So all of these places offering Jewish, Passover wine, they're making a lot of money.
But who was making it?
Who was making it? Well, you could get a license. You could license the government. Just as those near beer breweries, they got a license from the government to do it. But then they probably cooked the books, and right. That's right. Yeah, Jesse, person over here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Rite Aid in Highland Park.
Yeah.
Rite Aid in Highland Park goes back to the Prohibition days. They have a whole liquor section in there, and it goes back to when they were dispensing it. Before they moved across the street to Rite Aid, they had a small place, and there was a little screened-in doorway that you had to go through to get into to buy any kind of liquor whatsoever. So it harkens back, and some people say, a pharmacy with liquor? Yeah, it's from these days.
I have to say, there has to be some caution in attributing a place to be a speakeasy. A lot of these, or a house that has a big cellar, it said, oh, that must have been for, unloading rum from the ships. And for a while, at one point, I studied the Underground Railroad. And there's a lot of places that are claimed to be a stop on the Underground Railroad where slaves fleeing the South would be protected. But it's really hard to prove it. But if there's a case where there's a witness or there was a police raid, then you can confirm that a particular place was involved in bootlegging. Well, one of the two back there. Yep.
Rick Ludisher. I have read that the consumption of alcohol was actually higher during Prohibition in New Jersey than either before or after. Is this true?
Well, I have heard that, and it probably should be true because it sounds pretty good. But New Jersey was a totally wet state. New Jersey was one of the last states to vote for the Constitutional Amendment, the 18th Amendment, after it had already been in effect for a couple of years. They dragged their heels. They didn't want to do it. And it was one of the first states to vote for repeal because New Jersey was an urban state. It had a lot of immigrants who didn't want all of these Anglo-Saxons taking away their liquor. And so I've heard those statistics that, yes, consumption went up. Well, for one reason, consumption of alcohol went up was because women, for the first time, were going into saloons and speakeasies and places that had been formerly reserved for men. And these speakeasies tried to cater to women. There was a New York City nightclub that came up with a beer called Lipstick. It contained a lot of ginger ale and grenadine and sweet stuff that they thought would attract female customers. So I think that may have accounted for the increase, and probably because it was glamorous. Going into an old saloon before Prohibition, it was a grungy place. But if you go in there during Prohibition, it might still be, grungy, but you're sort of doing this illegal act, and there's a little bit of excitement there.
My name's Larry.
Yeah.
You make it sound like gangsters are completely in history. What are some of the current gangsters other than drugs, and do they operate in New Jersey? What industries?
You mean what's happening today?
Today and just the recent past.
Well, I can speak about nationally. The immigrant gangs of the Jews and Italians, have lost their influence, and now the fear of lawmen is these international cartels in Latin America and in Asia that are not smuggling liquor, but they're smuggling weapons, and they're smuggling money, and they're controlling finances. So the federal government is really focusing now on these international cartels. And the old world of the Prohibition gangsters is pretty much gone. Okay.
A lot has been said about Frank Sinatra being mobbed up. What's your opinion on how true that was, or what's involved?
Well, one of the great sources about gangsters is the FBI files, FBI Freedom of Administration, Freedom of Information files that you can look up on the internet. And you can see what stuff the FBI had on Frank Sinatra and all kinds of people. And real gangsters and Sinatra, and it's clear that J. Edgar Hoover hated Frank Sinatra. And he showed that Frank Sinatra was cavorting with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello and others in Cuba. And, but I don't think, so Sinatra hung around with mobsters, there's no question about it. But I doubt whether he was a mobster himself. You know, he was an entertainer, and that was his job. But the FBI Freedom of Information files, fascinating. Any other questions? Yeah, okay.
She's had her hand.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a little later in time. My father used to be in Philadelphia in the late 40s, early 50s, and he knew a fellow named Blinky Palermo, who evidently was a local mobster. Do you know anything about
Blinky Bolero?
Blinky?
Blinky? No, I'm sorry, I don't. No. But having family connections, let me, if I may, let me read from the dedication of my book. Then we can go on to more questions. People often, when I give this talk, they talk about their relatives. So let me just read my dedication. This book is dedicated to a man I never met, my great-uncle, Harry Mappin, who was born in 1895 to an immigrant family on New York's Lower East Side. He was a pickpocket, a drug dealer, a jeweler, a jewelry fence, and stool pigeon with a long arrest record. In 1925, he committed suicide in prison by swallowing cyanide poison. My shared DNA with great-uncle Harry is a genetic connection I have with the Prohibition generation. And so I say to people that I have this pickpocket DNA. And I think that's how come for 10 years I was a state employee. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Oh, I'm Isa Vogel. I grew up with this. My husband's family was retail. Mine was wholesale liquor, which was started in Perth Amboy. And I remember my father telling me that Frank Sinatra was dating Lonnie Swillman's widow.
Wow.
Did you ever come across anybody like Charlie the Blade or Lou Elkins?
No, I'm sorry. But for the next book. They were bookies. So bookmaking.
And
Bookmakers.
Charlie the Blade was a crook. That was in the line.
Yeah. I should say that was another industry was bookmaking. And one of the accomplishments of these Prohibition gangsters was to develop a telegraph system for racetrack gambling. So you could get accurate results in these bookie parlors. If you bet on a horse and the horse won, you would know about it because it would be telegraphed. So it was like a national wire service for racetrack results. Yeah.
One question.
Okay.
I'm interested in your research and everything that you learned about organized crime
Yeah.
after the Volstead Act and Prohibition. Legalization of marijuana. I mean, you know, we have these cartels, we have everything going on here that's very violent.
Yeah.
And it's similar to when they, that's how the organized crime started, you know, through
So Chris, is there a parallel between, since Prohibition was repealed, why not the prohibition of marijuana? I've thought about that, and I think one reason is that Prohibition, alcohol in America was inbred, and people grew up for centuries in America having beer, having a saloon at the corner, serving liquor at family meals. But for narcotics, it's always been a much narrower group of consumers, narrower group. So I just think there are fewer people who would want the legalization of narcotics. But if it does happen, I think it'll happen with marijuana first, before heroin, and methamphetamines and stuff like that.
I'll make the last question. I was going to ask, was
Las Vegas, did that come up after this basically, or was that active in Prohibition?
Las Vegas was some people say it was a desert, and along came the gangsters. Well, it wasn't a desert. It was a place they had like a cowboy boot kind of hotels, but gangsters came there. And the first one was Bugsy Siegel, who came to Las Vegas in 1947. Most of the gangsters were on the East Coast. He came to the West Coast to drum up business, and he came up with the idea of building a luxury gambling casino. Luxury. Didn't want this old cowboy howdy partner stuff. He wanted a sophisticated casino with entertainers from the East Coast, famous entertainers, and he succeeded in that. 1947. He was shot, some say because he was skimming money off the top. But I think you could say that the mob really was responsible for the modern day Las Vegas. And let me just also, since I love to talk, say that one of the most interesting things I found in doing research was the transcripts of a wiretap that had been done on the hotel room where Bugsy Siegel and his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, were staying. And so the FBI types picked up this foul language being used by Bugsy Siegel about what he was going to do to J. Edgar Hoover in graphic terms that I can't repeat here. And so the FBI agents, they didn't know what to do with this. Should we show this to J. Edgar Hoover? So in the files of the FBI, you can see the envelope they sent it with. To J. Edgar Hoover, FBI building, personal, confidential, contains, it didn't say adult material, but contains bad stuff. So J. Edgar Hoover got that and he read it, and he hated Bugsy Siegel and rejoiced when Bugsy Siegel was killed. J. Edgar Hoover hated a lot of people. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Thank you.